Thank you everyone for being here today. And I want to say that there's so many things I had to cut out of this lecture, and probably I didn't even do enough. But I have brought my computer with me. Any questions you have, if we don't have time in the Q&A, I will just sit with you individually afterwards and answer them. You can follow up with emails. I hope there will be many questions that get raised. So please, whatever your questions are, jot them down, and we'll get to them at some point. Okay. You already know the Black Death. Everybody knows Black Death. The Black Death is long been considered the largest, most severe, however you, whatever superlative you want to use, the most eventful and impactful pandemic in human history. There's a lot of books on it. There's a lot of scholarship on it. These are just the latest. These are whole books that have been published in English, in French, in German, and Italian. One just came out just a couple of weeks ago. And what they have all missed, I am going to be arguing today, is they have missed the complexity of the changes in historical work that now impinge on the narratives we need to tell about this most severe pandemic. The changes have been in three different areas. This one, paleogenomics, has gotten most of the attention. It's been getting attention in this field for close to 20 years, but particularly since 2011, when a major study was published in Nature that announced that the genome, pretty close to the whole genome of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague, was retrieved from the Black Death Cemetery in London. The cemetery itself had been excavated in the 1980s, and so this is now new work being done by molecular biologists to retrieve the organism. And on the left side there is one of the skeletal remains that was used for this study. I actually went to the London Museum to study this. It's a woman who was probably about 25 years old when she died. And what's circled there is the place where the molar was extracted that they used, and the whole recovery of, I think, almost all the Yersinia pestis that have been recovered today has been through the teeth. Okay, so it got a lot of publicity. What has not gotten a lot of publicity is that there have been other fields that have also been under really acute development in this same 20-year period. And this is the field of bioarchaeology. And that's all I want you to do. You don't, we don't need to go through all the information here, but all I want you to do is notice the dates. These are the excavation dates for these sites. You don't get any ADNA, the paleogeneticists work with. You don't get any of that biomolecular information unless you have a body to work with. So what the archaeologists are doing in opening up these sites that are connected to plague is hugely important and just tremendously advancing our knowledge every single day. But the excavation work takes time, the analytical work of the skeletal remains take time before any ADNA can be extracted. So the recency of this work absolutely has to be kept in mind at all times. What's also been developed, and this is my neck of the woods, is digital humanities. What does digital humanities have to do? These are old books, these are old manuscripts. How is this transforming? What it means is that the narratives that we have of the Black Death, in fact, the narratives that we have of almost all infectious diseases prior to the 19th century are verbal. They are human accounts of what humans have seen. Bringing in the physical evidence is this new discovery, this new amazing resource. But what it also means, and this is the essence of my argument, is that when we have new evidence of any kind, and in this case, new physical evidence, we also need to go back and look at our old evidence to see, do we need to read it differently? Is there something new that we can find? And the very fact that I can say to myself, I need to look again at the compendium, the concilium, that the Paris Faculty of Medicine wrote to King Philip VI in 1348. I need to look at that again. 5 minutes later, I'm online and I have the digital reproduction from Gallica at the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. Astounding resources that we have as pre-modernists now that we can reconnect with our physical evidence. Physical evidence in this case being these written words and works of art. So I can look at images, I can look at texts that haven't been edited, I can look at texts that I've never seen before. I can re-look at inscriptions and writings in the margins that haven't been studied before. I can even look at texts that are in languages I don't read, but then I can pull on my colleagues and say, can you look at this again and see if you see something different? Okay, so what has been happening, and I should think this would be predictable, when you have a whole new bunch of evidence for any historical problem, things are going to change in your narratives. And I'm arguing today that a lot of things need to change. But let's start with this one, which is the basic map we usually show when we're talking about the Black Death. It's usually this one or some derivative of it that's Europe focused. And it tells a narrative about plague arriving in this area of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, coming out of the Golden Horde, one of the Mongol Khanates, moving through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and then making this clockwise circuit through Europe. I think that's completely false. And I think it's because we have been working with very limited evidence, and basically building one piece of evidence upon another, and if something is dated later, we assume it actually happened later. But anyway, this is one of the things that I want you to start questioning in your head is how we think about what plague is and the speed with which it's moving and the directionality with which it is moving. Okay, so we have new evidence. We have to think about it. We have to incorporate it with the old evidence that we have. What do we do as historians? A lot of you work on the modern period. You work on documents that are already dated, they're already localized. You know who wrote them, sometimes you know who read them. The further you go back in time, the more that kind of information disappears. And so it is normal for us as medievalists to work with documents with texts that aren't dated. It is normal for us not to know who the authors are. So this is a skill that we especially have to hone as medievalists. In this case, here's a document, and I just want to highlight certain passages of it, is in the said year. So talking about a very specific event. At the end of March, a comet appeared, yada, yada, yada. In the middle there appeared a great mortality, that whoever fell ill, almost none escaped. So these aren't people just getting sick. These are people dying. And more than a sixth of the citizens died, even the best and the dearest. And more than 15,000 bodies, males and females and children, were buried in the city. This is a mass mortality event. This is a town that's a huge, but maybe 120,000 people. 15,000 deaths. You look at this and think, this must be the Black Death. You say, in this case, we know the author of it, Giovanni Villani, a very well-known chronicler from Florence. We know exactly when he died. He died during the Black Death. But look more closely at that passage. He's talking about a mortality that is over. He's talking about something in the deeper past. 1340 is the absolutely established date of this crisis. And when he died in 1348, he actually thought this 1340 crisis was bigger than the Black Death. This is always bigger, not new information, but this is information that we have chosen to ignore because it didn't fit our narrative about the Black Sea coming into the Mediterranean and sweeping aside in a period of about 4 years. This is the story that you have in your head. It's the story I have had in my head most of my life. It's the story coming from Boccaccio to Cameron of this sudden, incredibly lethal pandemic coming, killing lots of people, causing chaos, causing terror, having to have all of these burials being done, people sick in their beds, and then the whole story of the Cameron is the Regatta, the exodus of these very wealthy young people who are just running out of town and trying to forget the troubles that they've left behind. This is another thing that we have swept into the rug, which is this is also from Boccaccio. This is a autograph. This is his own writing, where he's talking about, he's just discovered some works of Petrarch. He's a fanboy of Petrarch. He is just in love with him as a poet. And sorry about the spacing here, but what this is he's just gotten some of his first copies of Petrarch's poetry, and he's copying them into his own notebook, his own name. And he says, at the end of this, describing the Petrarch, who's just been crowned as basically the king of poets. And first, here are those writings on the general mortality that occurred throughout the whole of Tuscany, and especially in Florence in the year of our Lord, 1340. Again, I didn't discover this. This has been sitting around and known to Petrarch Solitary forever, and they just have said to themselves, it must be a wrong date. It is not the wrong date. Okay, so what am I doing? What I'm doing is treating plague as a scientist does and saying this is a very complicated disease, vector-borne disease that normally passes through rodents and only very, very intermittently is getting into human populations. So it's not being passed normally from human to human. So we have to take all of these things into account, which also means that we have to bring in very disciplines. The climatology, because the flea rodent nexus is very contingent on the temperature, the ambient temperature. The climatic aspects are very important. We have to look at the humans. We also have to look at the rodents. The fleas we know nothing about at the moment, but the bacteria we actually now know a lot. So that's in the transformative part. That's why this new work is possible, because it is raising questions. Not that it has answered them, but it is raising the questions. Okay, so what am I doing today? I'm looking for the anomalies. I'm looking for the things we have swept under the rug, the things that we haven't paid attention to. I'm first going to gather together the physical evidence for this pandemic that nobody has seen. It goes back before even 1340. I'm going to look at how plague was conceived as a poison in pre-Black Death Europe. And I'm going to then talk about some of the repercussions of seeing the history of the first half of the 14th century in new ways, because, as I will argue, there are in fact two completely different pandemics that are happening, and we've only been looking at one of them. Okay, so the physical evidence. This is from a study that was just recently published. I disagree with the final conclusions, but I'm very intrigued by the evidence that was presented. This is from a manuscript. It's an undated manuscript, and the way normally we date manuscripts, especially illustrated manuscripts, is that art historians, codicologists have developed methods for approximating the dates of certain styles of writing, certain styles of decoration. And most people who have assessed this manuscript look at it and say, this is either late 13th century, early 14th century. The person who published this study says, no, it's got to be after the Black Death. Because the argument is that the person is in a sick bed. The wrapping on their head is probably signifying that they have a fever, but they're pointing to their underarm. And one of the ways that plague manifests, and actually the most important way it manifests in terms of symptomatology, is causing buboes. So in the neck, under the armpits, in the groin, the major lymph nodes. And she is describing this and saying, this image is meant to show someone complaining of major pain under their arm, which is defined with an inflamed lymph node, even though there's no bump there. And I actually find that part of the argument intriguing. Okay, so we have a source, Infectious. It's a book of surgery, but covering a lot of different medicine. He's writing in 1363, so about 15 years after the Black Death, and including there an account. It's very widely known and very, it's probably in every textbook that you've been used to teach the Black Death. The image on the right side is from a 15th century manuscript, but it is showing that very characteristic scene when you're dealing with plague of incising the buboes. The surgeon is going for the buboes in the thigh, but there's another one, as you can see, it's visible under the arm. He talks about the mortality began with us in the month of January. He's talking about the perspective of Avignon, where the people court is at the time. It was of two kinds. The first lasted for 2 months, and it was characterized by continuous fever and a spitting of blood. And men died of it within 3 days. The second lasted for the rest of the time. It too was characterized by continuous fever, by apostemes, swelling in carbuncles, and tumors in the external parts of the support. Okay, so very classic, but 2 waves. These are not the 2 waves that I'm talking about. I'm talking about much, much earlier. This is another study that has also been advocating for the traditional chronology of the Black Death. It came out just in December, and this is now using climate information to talk about what actually drove the Black Death that happened in 1347, 1348. And the argument here is that there is a major volcanic eruption. When you get volcanic eruptions that are of a certain size and magnitude, they can spew sulfates into the global atmosphere, causing obstructive light from the sun and inducing global cooling. So this is the argument they're making: is there's a 1347 volcano, it causes this cooling. There are crops that are affected by this, creating famine conditions, and those famine conditions then induce increased importation of grain from various places. So this area in the sea of around the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea is a major grain producing area. The Italians are importing their grain from it. So it's the infected grains, presumably infected grain with these rodents and their fleas, is moving through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and then to Venice, Genoa. And from there we get the explosion of the Black Death. This is very compelling. I actually agree with their work, and I'll be saying something more about it in a minute. Okay, so this is their argument. The year 1345 as a tipping point. The evidence that they use is dendrochronology, which is showing the differences in both temperature and rainfall that trees at different latitudes are showing. And it actually agrees with the opinion of the Paris faculty of medicine, who themselves said in 1348, it all started in 1345 because of a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. What I've been arguing, I and several colleagues have been arguing for the last several years, is that there's a longer story to the Black Death, or as we now regularly call it, the second pandemic, that starts in Central Asia, is spreading with a sudden, it's very distinct in the evolutionary tree for Yersinia pestis. A big bang, a sudden profusion of one mother strain of Yersinia pestis, moving east and being involved in the Mongol siege of Kaifeng, among other towns in 1232, but also moving westward. And what is happening here, this is a fourfold divergence with branches 2, 3, and 4 moving west or north and south. Branch 1 is moving west. And what I am arguing, I have been arguing, is that there is then focalization, that this new branch 1 reaches the Southern Caucasus and establishes new reservoirs there. Okay, so what we've had to do is go against 700 years of scholarship, of historiography about the Black Death, and address this issue of why, as everybody said, it's a sudden pandemic, it came out of nowhere, it's all tied to these events between 1345 and 1348. My argument boils down to we have been dealing with a Procrustes bed. Procrustes is our villain of one of the stories about Perseus. Procrustes would grab people on their way to the underworld and say, "Come and stay in my cave, sleep on this bed." And if they were too long for the bed, he would cut their limbs off. If they were too short, he would put them on a stretcher. So Procrustean argument is when you're doing everything you possibly can to get your evidence to fit the argument that you want to make. And I'll just give you several examples of that. I and my colleague Diane Tansey, who is the one who's been doing all this amazing work on the Arabic tradition, have been fighting mightily against that, and he has a wonderful piece out with one of his colleagues that came out last year that says that the 15-year window that really everybody's been citing since the 18th century, or actually really since the 15th century, that 15-year window in which supposedly all of this activity across all of Eurasia happened is fiction. I'd love to tell you more about it, but we have to keep going. So this is just to go back and say, when have any other historians disagreed? This is from a study, a major collection published in 1908, at which point Yersinia pestis has been identified microbiologically. Schicker is publishing a big volume on the history of the plague, and look what he found. Pests in Egypt, pests in the Steiermark, in southern Austria, Sterben, major mortalities in Russland. And I won't go through all of those dates, but as you can see, all of those dates predate 1348. So let's go back to that climate study. There's this, our 1345 volcano. But look what's also, this is now all of those different studies combined into one collective graph. There's an even deeper, more serious global cooling that happens with the growth of these anomalous exposure. And again, this is something that's been known for over 20 years. But it has been left out of Black Death studies because everybody assumes it can't possibly be relevant. Okay, so to continue now, I've said that branch 1 is moving westward, focalizes in the Caucasus. I think that part of branch 1 passes into the Mediterranean, so that is our regular narrative about the Black Death, but part of it also passes northward into Eastern Europe. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the time today. Okay, so the dating of the Big Bang, this is, I'm just going through this just to document that I have gone through all of the phylogenetic studies, all the paleogenetic studies, and seeing where the trends are in terms of the consensus that studies are showing. And the consensus in dating the Big Bang, that original point of proliferation of plague, everybody has been saying it goes back to at least the 13th century, if not earlier. So this is a study that is still in preprint, hopefully will be coming out soon. This is another study, here's 1A. So my argument is that branch 1 very immediately splits into branches 1A and 1B. And this is just showing where that dividing line. These are all strings. These are individual samples and falling into this phylogenetic tree. We don't need to look at all the details of it right now. But the very early, the earliest change, in fact, is this split between 1A and 1B. Another study from the Toulouse lab that is showing 1A, 1B, and again, the very early split. In this case, they're giving a possible date as early as 1228. And this is from the McMaster lab, just across the river, in fact, over in Canada, which is also splitting 1A from 1B and saying very clearly it happens before 1300. Okay, that's the phylogenetics. Problem with the dating that's been done by the labs who are producing this work, which are, and all of these studies are making historical arguments. The problem is that the dating, these samples that are coming from these bodies that have been excavated, unless you have a perfectly dated cemetery, and in a couple cases there are, but in most cases they're not. Many cemeteries are used attritionally, so that they're used for decades, maybe even hundreds of years. So radiocarbon dating is brought in to help date these samples. It's too broad. I mean, it gives us, you can maybe say the century, but usually it's about 100 to 120 years for this time period. So this is a sample, this is a study that is not yet been peer reviewed. It's been sitting in pre-peer review state for the last 3 years. But one of its samples, they the date was in this range of 1269 to 1380. Again, that's a huge range. But the thing about radiocarbon dating is that there are still probabilities within those ranges. And this is for the radiocarbon experts to be able to explain, but basically there are higher probabilities at certain years. And this one is marked here where you see that plus sign, is that's where the highest probability of the date of the sample is. And as you can see, and even the hill that's under, that falls in the 13th century. That's from the Smithsonian, from Eastern Europe. And so that's the Otapa. And then this is a sample from Germany, which is in the same clade. It's more evolutionarily developed. And this is then at the next phase of development. And the thing about these two samples, this is from Arnhem. And again, these are all lineage 1A that I'm talking about. This one, if you look at the highest probability for both those samples, they fall exactly in the middle of the 14th century, right when we expect the Black Death to happen. Except what this this laboratory has been arguing consistently across a number of different studies is this can't be the right date. Because everybody knows the Black Death didn't start until 1347, 1348. And so what they proposed in the study, which I said is still unpublished, is that we need to fix the radiocarbon date. I'm not making this up. You can go look at it, it's sitting in our bioarchive. We need to fix the radiocarbon date because it doesn't, it's not giving us the results we want. Okay, so what I want to say is, if you don't change the radiocarbon dates, that's looking like it's Black Death in the traditional chronology. Okay, and just before we leave this, I know this is complicated, and this is, I mean, by its very nature, these phylogenetic trees are abstract, but they are extracting a lot of information to create chronological arguments. Before we leave, I just want to highlight this this Nauberg sample, and I just want you to register how early it is evolutionary. Okay, we'll look at more about that later. Okay, so if I am right that there's something going on with plague in Europe a lot earlier than the regular chronology of the Black Death, even before the 1340 date that Boccaccio and Villani was giving, why haven't we never seen this before? That's really the key question. Why haven't we seen it before? And we haven't seen it, number one, because we didn't have the biomolecular information to confirm that it was plague, or to give us a sense of how this organism is evolving. But we also didn't have a lot of the bioarchaeology, and we didn't have, frankly, and I'm saying this as a historian of medicine my entire life, we didn't have the good sense to ask. This is, these are some images of the upper part is kind of a city plan for this town in what is now the Czech Republic, called Kutná-Hora Sedlec, and below is the photograph from the results of excavations that were done just in the 2010s. And this is the summary of it. Beneath and beside the Church of All Saints, two stratigraphically distinct levels containing 32 mass graves with approximately 1,200 skeletons per site. So this is excavation work that's already happened. The analytical work is still ongoing. And they have done sample testing for years. You're seeing it. Well, for pathogens, they haven't reported what their results yet were, and I expect, I don't know when that's going to happen. But look at the label. Kutná-Hora Sedlec in the question of great famine mortalities from 1315 to 13. What plague is hiding behind is a designation that we have also been using in medieval historiography to talk about famine mortalities in this period. Here are two sites that are among several now that we can talk about. But this is a plaque that's erected. It's actually erected later. But it's saying in the year of our Lord, 1316, here we're buried, and the total comes up to 7,895. Thousands of people who have died in the years of dearth. God have mercy on them. Kutná-Hora Sedlec, which I was just talking about, this is a chronicle account. Within the space of a year, as I learned by experience, 30,000 men were buried at the gate of the Abbey of Sedlec. A similar pestilence also existed in all the states, towns, and villages, and throughout the whole country. Pits were dug in all places and filled with the corpses of the dead. We have known this all along, but everybody has just wiped it away and said, it's famine. Okay, so I won't go through all of these details, but basically, this is the point that we're at now, that we have different sites that have been excavated. Some of them have been studied for the presence of plague, others have not. But we have a lot of questions that we should be asking about this. One of them, and which we'll look at in a minute, actually has documented Yersinia pestis. But before I get there, what can mice tell us? This is another study, again, it just came out last year, which is extremely important in my thinking about how did we miss this? Why weren't we seeing this? This is a study that took samples from, so we reconstructed genomes of the first plague pandemic from late antiquity, 68th century, other samples from the second plague pandemic, so the later Middle Ages of the modern period, and then the third pandemic, which is the one from the late 19th into the 20th century. And those samples came from Vietnam, and they're still alive. The samples are still given under cultivation in the laboratories of the Institut Pasteur in Paris. And what they did was, in all three situations, some of the genomes have lost the same part of the genome. And this has been noted before when these the earlier studies were published, but what they did with this study was say, we have the living genomes from Vietnam, let us do laboratory tests on mice to see what the effect of these the strains that have lost this section of the genome. And what they found was an attenuation of virulence. In the bubonic models, but not in the pneumonic. So when it gets in the lungs, it's being it's killing in an entirely different way, or the septicemic models. With this PLA inactivation, this is the protein, there are up to 1 million-fold increase in the median lethal dose. Let me translate that into normal speak, which is, it's 1 million times less virulent than the most virulent strains of plague. And what this means is that, so and it's happening close to about half the time with these historical strains. What it means is that the organism will kill more quickly, which means that the animal that is infected can travel further before it dies and its fleas hop off and find a new victim. So you can get longer distance spread, and it seems less presentation of bubonic symptoms. A less virulent, still lethal, but less virulent, slower moving organism. How does it manifest in humans? That's what I was asking. And what the answer was is we were looking for the wrong thing. Why haven't we seen it? It was because we weren't paying attention, but we didn't know what vocabulary or categories to look for. I'll talk about in a second Adler's poison thesis, but I just want to contrast this is Adler. This is a study published in 2021, and he's been throwing this idea out for a few years before that, is that plague is seen as a kind of poison of the body, a very quick death. He wasn't reading any of Collard's work, who spent over 20 years studying the poison literature. So it's just a clear divergence in historiography that one side is simply not paying any attention to what other scholars are doing. And the significance about Collard's work is that he sees 4 main periods of production, the first of which begins 1290 to 1330, well before the Black Death. And then I'll get to later Barzilai's work. Okay, I'm going to go through this very quickly, but essentially Adler's is saying that When Black Death comes along, so he recognizes that there is already some poison out there. He didn't eat all of it. But he recognizes that poison as a category is new. And in fact, poison as a category is in ancient literature as well, it's in other cultures as well. There are a lot of poison animals in the world. There are a lot of substances to look at the phenomenon of very sudden deaths. Very sudden deaths. And that's what plague looks like. It's a very sudden death when you don't know it. And this is just this writings on poison. And this again, just putting together where they're written, who they're written for. And you can see the pattern. Again, this is starting around the late 13th century and rising to a peak. Now, I have a lot of things here that I'm already out of time. Or getting close to end of time. So I want to go through this very, very quickly, but what I've been able to document is that when you look at who the texts have been written for, they're written for very high-level people. In this case, the emperor. I'm sorry, this is not written for him, but his case of poisoning when he's on campaign in northern Italy. His wife dies at the siege of Brescia. He himself gets sick at the siege of Brescia, but dies 2 years later at Siena. And his brother, who will play another role in the story, Baldwin of Luxembourg, was present on the expedition as well. I've never done any of this political history before. This has just been astounding to me. Johann Haig, the best physician in the world. How many people here have heard of Johann Haig? That's what I thought. I had never heard of him either, and he was considered the best physician in the world in the first half of the 14th century. What is he doing? He's at the papal court. He's working for one emperor who's working for another emperor. Everybody knows who he is. And what is he writing about? He's writing about poisons for Henry's successor, Louis of Bavaria, talking about these poisons and look at all of these things. He's working with the best recent work that's come out of southern Italy, new translations to the Greek of Hellenic works that have just been brought to the papal court at Avignon. He has everything. He is the top of society, and we haven't seen any of this. What happened at Amberg? This is just to show you where Amberg is, and right there is a new hospital that is created on the edge of town with land that is donated by Louis the Bavarian in 1317. 1317, why is that significant? Great famine. And what is found there? All of these mass burials from 1317, which the archaeologists who excavated it said the manner of burial deviates so clearly from what would be expected in a medieval churchyard. This is a society that is terrorized by what is happening. Now, there's Amberg. Down the road is Nauburg. 26 kilometers away, 16 miles, you can cover it in one day on foot, even faster from horse. What do we find at Nauburg? We find Yersinia pestis. When this was published, it was simply assumed it must be Black Death, and so this laboratory has been referring to it as Black Death strains ever since then. There is no documentary evidence that there was ever a Black Death outbreak in this town. Okay, so there's more of this. Then Johann Haig then works for Henry's son, John of Bohemia, writing a whole tract on poisons for him. And what he is also doing, and this is the flex that I have to make, is, so I said he's working for the highest echelons of European society in the first half of the 14th century. But he also includes a section, medicine for the poor. And what does he tell them to do? Eat walnuts. You can substitute them with hazelnuts if you want. Mix in some rue, mix in some salt. You're fed. You're protected from poisons. Why do poor people need to be protected from poisons? It's because they also start calling it epidemia. The figs and the ruse and the hazelnuts. I have this from the Bishop of Freising, whom I consider to be the best physician in the world. Who's the Bishop of Freising? Johann Haig. Everybody knows who he is. This is to cure epidemia. This is now talking about the gibbets, the lump. So the moon, when it's waxing past the half stage, we call it gibbous. It's swollen. These are the swellings. And then where are the swellings? They're in the groin, under the arm, and in the neck. Another indication, this is another recipe for against epidemia, is the Bishop of Verden. This was his previous citation. So it might be from, this might have been written in the 1330s, abstain from approaching the sick and the dead. Similar things, other things. So what's jumping ahead now is what is going on in the papal court of everybody has been jumping to Vita Sholiak and taking Vita Sholiak's testimony about this. But another one, and again, we all know this aside as well, Louis Heiligen, he's a cantor, musician at the papal court. He writes back to his colleagues in Bruges, you know, this catastrophe is going on, and he says, at the Pope's orders, all of these dissections are being done to find out where the poison is in the body. But it's also happening in Italy. How did they know? All of a sudden, this is being written in April. Presumably, Plato arrived in January. How do you get this whole apparatus up and started in 3 months in the midst of chaos? Nobody's ever asked that question. Anyway, other things that we could say about Italy, and this is just going back to Villani. These are all the pestilencia that, in fact, Villani talked about. We've had Villani in front of us for hundreds of years, and we have never paid attention to this larger pattern. This is just a map to summarize. This is what the House of Luxembourg, the areas that they control. They control Luxembourg in the west. They control Bohemia in the center of Europe, and they control northern Italy. All of these places where what I'm now calling plague is breaking out. Okay, so what is then the Black Death that we've been talking about? The Black Death, the Boccaccio theory, is a new way of plague. So remember, we have 1A, this is 1B. It's coming through the Mediterranean, it's coming, I think, from the Southern Caucasus reservoir. And the distinctive thing that nobody in the North ever says is when you're dealing with Southern reports, they all say, and they spit blood. And this one, it's just from Al-Safadi, who's in Damascus. Every person in the morning or evening breathed out blood from his throat as if he had been slain without a knife. That's how distinctive this new symptomatology of pneumonic plague is. Okay, and yes, we're out of time. We're out of time, and so I will just jump to this map is showing all the Jewish persecutions from the late 13th century to the 14th century. Or just the middle of the 15th century. What has already been done since the study I've already skipped over by Barzilai, making the argument that there's a wave of accusations of well poisoning that's mostly directed against lepers in the 1320s, and then we get this wave of accusations against Jews of well poisoning in the 1340s. He basically treats it as just a coincidence that these two sets of persecutions are so parallel. I think they are completely related because they're both related to plague. Okay. Following river systems, and this is just something that somebody else is going to need to explore, is the idea that when you have these climatic changes, the climate is everywhere. So the plague is already present in reservoirs. That it can break out. I'm gonna leave with this one. There's a couple more things that I want to say, but what I've been doing for the last over 20 years is reading through the microbiological literature, the virological literature, the evolutionary work, and saying, are there ways that we can study pandemics comparatively? This is a slide showing the work that Michael Warby and colleagues have done on HIV/AIDS. Similar things can be said about tuberculosis, similar things can be said about really mostly infectious diseases now. And they are now being said about Ebola that's coming out of Democratic Republic of Congo. So the kinds of things we're learning about how much we missed about the largest pandemic in human history are questions we should be raising about all the other pandemics in human history. Thank you very much.